Hello everyone, welcome to a webinar on what you don't protect in code signing will impact you. Thank you everyone for joining in. I hope you're all doing great. My name is Subhi Singh. I'm the senior consultant with Encryption Consulting. We also have our speaker Riley Dickens from Encryption Consulting. If you have any questions, please remember to share your questions in the Q&A bar below. And now I will hand it over to Riley.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest Encryption Consulting webinar. My name is Riley Dickens, and I'm a senior consultant at Encryption. And welcome to our latest Encryption Consulting webinar. My name is Riley Dickens, and I'm a senior consultant at Encryption Consulting and the lead developer of our code signing platform, CodeSign Secure. Now, today we're going to be talking about protecting your code signing. And what we'll do is we'll first start off by going into the different code signing workflows that are available. So you'll understand how code signing works and also how our different pieces, connect together, why you would need code signing, things like that. After that, we'll dive into vulnerabilities because of weak code signing. So you'll get a better idea of what makes weak code signing and what kind of vulnerabilities are in place in these weak code signing platforms. After that, we'll talk about the real world impact. We'll talk about a fairly recent GitHub breach that occurred in relation to code signing and how they actually mitigated that attack. Next, we'll talk about code signing strategy. So we'll discuss a little bit about what makes a good code signing strategy, how you can format your code signing strategy, and the specific parts to focus on when designing a code signing strategy. After that, we'll talk a little bit about CodeSign Secure, our code signing platform. And then finally, we'll talk about the future of code signing. So let's get started with the code signing workflow. Now, starting off, it might look a little complicated, but realistically, code signing is a fairly simple process. It starts off with the software, the code that you're attempting to sign or a developer is attempting to sign. And what they do first is they pass it through a hashing algorithm. Now, that hashing algorithm will generate a unique hash digest, it's called. And the reason I say this is unique is because that's a very important part of the code signing process and why we use hashing in code signing. With hashing, if you were to, say, pass a piece of code through a hashing algorithm, and then you were to pass the same piece of code, but with one single letter or one single number changed, that hash digest that comes out is completely different in every way. So, as you can see, having a completely unique hash digest is very important. Now, another important point about hashing and hash digests is that they're irreversible. So that means that basically, once you create this unique hash digest, there's no way for an attacker to get a hold of it and reverse engineer it to actually get that original code back. So as you can see, it's a great way and a very important first step in the code signing process. So after you hash your file, you will then go and encrypt it. So encrypting it involves using a private key. So with encryption, you have asymmetric encryption in this case, and you have a public and a private key. And that private key is what you're actually signing your code with. Only the creator of the key should actually have access to that private key, whereas the public key, anyone can see and anyone can use. Now, in code signing, we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but just for a brief overview, in code signing, there is a forum called the CA Browser Forum, and they handle all the compliance mandates, all the best practices, basically everything related to security in code signing, and they release these different compliance standards and things like that that ensure that everyone is following best practices and keeping, end users safe. Now, they recently released in 2023 a mandate that all private keys for code signing should be stored in a hardware security module. So as you can see here, I have the private key stored in a hardware security module. Now, what happens is that hash digest is sent over to the HSM and the private key associated with the user is in that HSM. Now the HSM works with the private key and the hash digest to create a signature. So once they encrypt that hash digest and create that signature, we then move to adding our timestamp. Now, that timestamp is a very important piece that we'll touch on a little bit later, but for now, just think of it as a way of putting the date and time that the code was signed onto that signature block. Now, the final piece of the signature block is our certificate. The certificate itself is associated with the public key. So the public key is actually on that certificate, and that links that certificate with the private key that was used for signing. So now we have our full signature block, which includes our certificate, our hash digest, which has now been encrypted and a signature has been generated, as well as the hash algorithm that was used to hash that original file. So this is all part of the process of verifying that a piece of code is signed, who it's signed by, and when it was signed. So now that we have that full signature block created, we then package that up and we have our completely code signed piece of code. So now that we get a better idea of what code signing is, let's talk about why you would need code signing. And there's a number of different reasons, way more than I can show here. But for just a brief overview, I'll touch on 4 different needs of code signing. So the first one is software authenticity. An end user will want to know that a piece of software is from the organization they expect it to be from, and they want to know that it's from a trusted organization. So signing your piece of code gives that end user the authenticity of that code. They know, okay, I trust this organization. They say they've signed this, which means they must have used best practices and standards that they need to use to protect the code so there's no malware in it and it's safe for me to use. Now, another important piece for code signing is understanding that the point of code signing, or one of the points of code signing, is to ensure the integrity of the code. We hash the code, we make sure we secure every piece of the pipeline in our code signing platform. And it's just so important to make sure that the end user knows you have every security measure that you need in place to make sure that that code cannot be taken by an attacker and misused or injected with malware or anything like that. Now, another important piece is security and compliance. And compliance is across all different fields. Pretty much every organization will have some amount of compliance that they're required to follow. So having code signing in place and utilizing code signing is a big part of a lot of these different regulations and standards and compliance standards. So it's very important to make sure you have the right features in place, you have the right security in place so that you meet these compliance standards and you don't get any type of fines or you don't hurt the end user in any way. And then our final need for code signing is non-repudiation. Now, non-repudiation may seem a bit odd here, and non-repudiation is basically the idea that someone who has signed a piece of code can't deny having actually signed that piece of code. And the reason for this is to make sure organizations are held accountable if they are insecurely managing their keys, managing their certificates, or managing their code in general. Because if an organization were to sign a piece of code and they were attacked and an attacker was able to inject code at some point in the code signing process, that organization, without the non-repudiation of the signature, would be able to say, oh, well, we didn't actually do that, so you can't fine us, you can't get mad at us, our reputation can't be damaged, it's a lie. Now, with this signature, it's immediately apparent that they have allowed something to happen where the certificate or the code was able to be misused or injected with malware and sent to an end user. So it's a really big piece of the code signing process to make sure that that non-repudiation is in place. So we've taken a look at code signing in general, what it is, how it works, and the needs for code signing. Now let's look at some weak code signing. Now, there are a lot of risks involved with weak code signing, and one of the biggest ones is the signing of unverified code. If you're not verifying your code is safe and secure to use, empty of vulnerabilities before sending it out to an end user, it can cause a big issue. You can run into a lot of issues with reputational damage, as well as harming your end users because they now have a piece of code that has malware because you didn't check or is vulnerable to attack by different attackers. Now, another risk of weak code signing is improper key protection. So I talked a lot about the HSMs and securing your keys, but the reason we need to secure these keys in these hardware security modules is because if a threat actor can get access to your keys and use them to sign some piece of code, it now looks like your organization has sent out malware in a piece of code. So, of course, immediately they're going to see your signature on it, and your end users will say, okay, I'll download this. I trust them. And all of them will get infected with malware. So it's really important to have strong code signing so that this issue never comes up. Now, another big factor is non-compliance. We talked a lot about compliance and compliance standards, and not meeting compliance standards, you may at first think you get a slap on the wrist, but in reality, it's much bigger than that. Of course, you get the reputational damage across your, organization and in relation to your organization, but more importantly, you'll also get a lot of different fines. There's a huge fine from all of these compliance and standards, and you'll end up losing a lot more than you would gain from just putting good security in place in your code signing pipeline. And then one of the final risks of weak code signing that we'll talk about is missing timestamps. Now, you might say, oh, well, my code isn't going out to end users, or even if it is, why do I need a timestamp? It doesn't seem that important to know when it was signed. Well, this is actually a great point to make, is that with timestamps, if you sign a piece of code and say 10 years down the line, that code has never been changed, users are still using it, but the certificate finally expires. Well, users will still be able to use that piece of code that was signed 10 years ago because you have a timestamp on it. The OS of the system trying to run the software will read that the timestamp was within the time frame that the certificate had not expired yet. And so it'll immediately know, okay, this is fine to use, it's a valid signature, and you can go from there. So as you can see, timestamping your files is very important, especially for future-proofing your pieces of code. Now, one quick note I'll make here, we talked about that compliance and the fines you can incur. Here's an example of a good one. The GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation, has a lot of fines. And if you fail to meet the GDPR and you're required to meet it, you can get fines of up to 20 million pounds or 4% of your annual global turnover. So it's not a insignificant fine there. That's a pretty huge fine to get, not only including harming your end users and the reputational damage it incurs. So at the end of the day, being proactive with your security, especially in the code signing field, is very important. Now, here's a few of the major pitfalls that I see a lot of organizations run into in regards to code signing. The first one is manual certificate and key management. And you may see this outside of code signing as well. Manually keeping track of all the keys and certificates, ensuring they're renewed and don't expire, is extremely time consuming, especially in a very large organization. So it makes sense that in code signing, manually tracking all this as well is also a very complicated process. Now, another pitfall I see a lot of the time is the lack of revocation handling. So if you aren't up to date with your CRLs or your OCSPs within your PKI, and you're sending out certificates for signing and things like that, these certificates can be compromised, and you don't know when you've revoked them, or a certificate might expire, but it hasn't been put in the CRL. So, no one knows that it's actually been expired. And this just causes a lot of issues with certificate misuse and things like that. Now, another major issue I see as well is the use of self-sign or untrusted certificates. And what I mean by this is mainly for sending out code to end users. So there's the option to use a self-signed certificate, but you shouldn't do that, and you can't do that for the most part to send out code to end users, just because anyone can create a self-signed certificate, even an attacker. Now, you can use your internal PKI to create a code signing certificate, and you could send it out to end users, but they don't know your PKI. There are publicly trusted certificate authorities that whenever you get a fresh Windows laptop, all of those certificate authorities are already in the trusted certificate store. So you immediately know those are trusted, which is why the third option, EV or OV code signing certificates, is what all code signers will use to actually send out code to end users. So it's very important to use those as opposed to those untrusted certificates or the self-signed certificates. Now, another important point I like to make is monitoring and auditing. Most organizations will get audited at some point in their time, and it's very important to make sure you have logs where, especially in the code signing sphere, you're tracking who has signed what, when they signed it, what they signed, and what certificate they were able to access. This is especially big if you say have an attack happen and someone tries to sign with a certificate they shouldn't have access to. Immediately, you can stop the signing, you can go back and track where they got it from, and then you can continue the investigation from there. Now, another important point I like to make is weak software development lifecycle integration. It's a big deal when you have a very weak, say, CI/CD pipeline or something like that. So making sure that's up to date and it's integrated thoroughly with your code signing platform is very important. And the reason that is, honestly, is because if you have code signing in that CI/CD pipeline, that means every developer is going to have to follow the path of creating their code, getting it signed, and then sending it out. And that just ensures that every piece of code that leaves your organization is being signed. And it makes sure that you have specific policies and standards in place that all developers are following. Now, the final issue I'll talk to you about with weak code signing is expired or non-renewed certificates. So very similar to revocation handling, but getting a little more specific with the certificates themselves. A lot of the time, these certificates will expire or they'll be revoked or whatever the case may be, and they don't actually get renewed, which causes a holdup with your developers getting things signed. And then that causes an issue to develop where the actual code isn't getting out on time. So it just causes a lot of different log jams, which is why it's important to make sure, you have these different things in place to make sure your certificates aren't actually expiring. So we've taken a look at some of the more theoretical side of code signing. We can actually take a look at a more recent attack or a breach that occurred and how it was handled in the real world. Now, back in December of 2022, we had GitHub find that there was some unauthorized access to some of their repositories, and it was specifically their repositories for GitHub Desktop and Atom applications. So that's a pretty big deal. Thousands, if not millions of users are using those applications all the time. So that's no small, issue to run into. Now, some key points I'll bring up about this. With this breach, they discovered that 3 encrypted certificates were compromised. This was 2 DigiCert ones, which are related to Windows signings, and an Apple developer ID, which is involved in Mac signings. Now, in their investigation, there is no real evidence of misuse. So they didn't see anyone had actually signed anything with these since they'd been taken. But GitHub actually did something that a lot of organizations today don't do, which is being proactive with their security. So not only did they find that there is no evidence of misuse, they still went ahead and proactively revoked those certificates. And that's honestly great. A lot of organizations will, see a breach has happened, see nothing has been, misused or anything like that, and they'll continue on. But GitHub got ahead of it and said, well, we don't want the future to be at risk, so let's revoke this now and deal with this now. And so they did. And that's honestly a great security stance for them to have and for any organization to have. Now, some of these infected versions, there was a time period where these specific versions of the Mac and Atom applications came out where they said these series of versions could potentially have been breached and filled with malware. As far as we're aware, that didn't happen, but to be safe, we want all of our customers to downgrade or upgrade past these versions that potentially could have been infected. So not only did they revoke the certificates, they were even more proactive and told all their users, don't even use these versions, just move above or below them. And honestly, that's a fantastic way to, handle such a breach, especially when they found no misuse. Still being proactive is such a big deal and so important to ensuring you have, strong security and a name people can trust. So we've taken a look at the theoretical, we've taken a look at the practical. Let's talk code signing strategy. Having a good, strong code signing strategy is very, very important. And this all usually starts with the key storage and management. The reason that the CA Browser Forum came out with those rulings on hardware security modules is because those keys are the main pivot point of code signing. You can't do any signing without a key to actually create the signature. Now, a lot of the ways that I'll see organizations actually store their keys is in software-based components or things like that. They might use something, software-based as opposed to hardware-based. And you may say, oh, it's secure, it encrypts the key, it keeps it protected. But honestly, if someone can break into your computer, they can probably break into there and take the key as well. So that's the most commonly misused code signing keys are taken from software-based key storage. So not only does the CA Browser Forum require you to use HSMs, it's better to just be smart and utilize an HSM for all your keys, especially code signing keys. Now, these HSMs or hardware security modules are basically these big, secure, tamper-resistant devices that'll sit in a rack at your data center. And the only way to get the keys off of them would be for a threat actor to not only get into the data center, but also to crack the encryption on the device. And the device itself, if it's shaken too much, if it's bumped too much, if it's moved too much, will delete everything on it. It'll zeroize the HSM and all the keys are lost. So it's a fantastic device to make sure that attackers can't get these keys and misuse them, which is, the reason that the CA Browser Forum has mandated that they're used in code signing. Now, amongst the things I've already talked about with HSMs, some other important points are it has multi-factor authentication, it has role-based access controls. So basically, you have multiple users to do one task, and one person can't do everything on the HSM. So that can stop insider threats. That can stop someone from getting themselves, full control over the HSM. They can only have control of certain roles at a certain time. So it takes at least two people to do any task on the HSM, basically. Now, not only that, they have high availability and redundancy. So if you have two HSMs, one goes down at one data center, the other one picks right back up where the other one left off, and there's no issues there, no downtime. And there's a lot of elimination of key exposure with these HSMs. We talked about these software-based key storage methods, but the hardware-based key storage methods, the HSMs, are certified by the NIST. They have so many different compliance standards that they meet and that certain organizations are required to meet. So I imagine a lot of your companies already have HSMs there. So why not put it into your code signing process? Now, just a few notes here. 60% of organizations experienced a security incident due to improper management of code signing keys. So, like I said, that happens very commonly, and it's usually based on not using an HSM. And another important point is the global HSM market is on a sharp rise. So it's projected to hit 1.67 billion US dollars by 2032. So as you can see, more and more regulations, more and more compliance are requiring these HSMs to be used. So if you have one, you can just utilize it for anything in your organization you need it for, including code signing. Now let's take a look at some of the best practices for code signing. A lot of it we've already talked about, but it's still important to reiterate those even if we've already discussed them. Now, the first one is granular role-based access control. This is basically having a separation of roles and duties within your organization and just making sure that one person can't do everything within your code signing platform. One person should be able to approve signings, one person should be able to do the signings, and another person should be able to create the keys for signing. You don't want someone that can do everything and doesn't have someone else checking over their work, basically, and making sure they're on track and they should be signing And it also stops a lot of unauthorized access to signings that shouldn't occur. Now, integration into CI/CD pipelines, we talked about this a little bit, but it's so important to do this because if one developer is doing it and it's a policy across your organization, all developers will have that integrated into their CI/CD pipelines, and it ensures that all of your code is signed before it goes out to end users. Now, signing policies and approval workflows are another great way of maintaining a secure code signing environment. Basically, the idea here is that if someone goes to sign something with their certificate, there's an approver on the other side, and the signing doesn't actually go through until that approver can approve. Now, usually that'll be a manager, the owner of the platform, whatever it may be. As long as you have two people in place, that ensures someone can't sign a piece of code injected with malware, or a threat actor can't pretend to be someone and try and sign code with their certificate. So it's a great way of just stopping these different attacks from happening and ensuring, you have these best approvals and workflows in place. Now, timestamping, again, we talked about this with the certificate expiring, but you have a timestamp so you can continue to use it from there. And that's just a really important point to reiterate because timestamping is vital and necessary for code signing going out to end users. Now, regular rotation of keys and certificates is something we haven't really talked about. And the idea here is to rotate those keys so that it is considered the same key, but the data changes. So in that way, you're keeping your keys, you're keeping your certificates, up to date. They're not sitting there for 10 years at a time, waiting for a threat actor to take it and utilize it. It's getting renewed, often. And say a certificate or a key had been taken and you weren't aware of it. If you're regularly renewing these keys or these certificates, it will get rid of that old one. So the old one becomes irrelevant if it got taken without you noticing. So it's a great way to make sure, expired credentials aren't being exposed and that you have that ensured continuity within your organization and within those keys and certificates. Now, of course, a secure signing environment is vital. I don't really need to say this, but I still do. It's so important to keep it secure. Have your developers that are using the code signing client, make sure that they are up to date on their Windows updates or their Mac updates. They're basically keeping up to date with any software or hardware updates that need to go through so that an attacker can't use a vulnerability in, say, the Windows OS to get to your code signing. And then finally, maintaining logging and auditing. Again, it's very important for auditors if they come in, but also important for you if a threat actor were to get use of a certificate. They wouldn't be able to use it for very long because you track where it was, which certificate it was, and then cut off that certificate. Now we'll take a brief look at our code signing platform, CodeSign Secure. Now, we address a lot of the vulnerabilities we talked about today. And the first of which is we manage all our keys within FIPS 140-2 certified HSMs. Now, when we talk a little bit more about the CA browser forum rulings at the very end, that is a mandate of one of their latest forum rulings. So we utilize those HSMs and we're vendor neutral. So if you want to use a Unimako, an Entrust, or a Thales HSM, feel free. It works perfectly with CodeSign Secure. Now, we also have a PKCS 11 library integration, so you can do any cross-platform signing you would want to do for Linux, for Mac, for Windows, whatever it may be. It's very simple to do with CodeSign Secure. Now, we also actually utilize something that I notice a lot of different code signing platforms don't use, which is client-side hashing. Now, there are two different options for hashing when you're doing code signing, or mainly two. And those would be client-side and server-side hashing. So with server-side hashing, what you're doing is you're signing the code or you're hashing the code. And before you actually hash it on the client side, you send it over to the server side. So you're sending the base code on its own to the server. The server then hashes it and then creates that signature, sends back the signature, and you have your code signed. But the problem with that is you're sending your code across the network and a man-in-the-middle attack can happen at any time. So having that code insecurely sent across the network is a big deal. Now, with CodeSign Secure, we do client-side hashing. So we hash on the client side. Your code never leaves your client computer. The hash alone is all that goes over to the server, which then creates the signature. Signature is sent back, and you're good to go. So as you can see, it's a much better way and a much more fluid way of getting a signature without having to actually send your code across the network. Now, we also offer software vulnerability scanning with SBOM. So if you want to get all your files checked for vulnerabilities before actually getting them out to end users and getting them signed, you can use our SBOM capabilities. We also, like I said, meet all of the CA Browser Forum baseline requirements. So not only the hardware security modules for key protection, but all of their different requirements that are needed for code signing, we meet within, those standards and practices. Now, we also have a very advanced access control, role-based access control. So no one person can have access to the same operation. So it's basically split up into different roles. You have someone who can approve, you have someone who can create keys, and you have someone who can sign, is the most basic way of looking at it. Now, going along with that, CodeSign Secure also integrates with any CI/CD pipelines you may be using at your organization. So whether it be Jenkins, Azure DevOps, Bamboo, anything like that, we integrate with it. And there's no need to change, what you're using now. We can integrate with it very easily, and you just continue as you are. We also offer reproducible build and verification through GitHub and Jenkins. So if you need to use anything like that, or you're currently using anything like that, you can do that very easily with CodeSign Secure. And we also have automated backups and scheduled backups. So if you ever want to keep backups for, say, every month, for every 6 months, it doesn't have to be a manual process. It's all automated, and you can make sure that everything on your CodeSign Secure server is backed up at any time you need it. Now, we also have signed audit trails, which is a great way of centralizing your different audit logs and your different signing logs, and also making sure that these logs they're immutable, basically. They can't be changed. They are set as they are, and they're signed off on. So you know right away that these are trusted logs. Then we also have our custom ECKSP, or our encryption consulting key storage provider. And this basically gives you secure access for both Windows and Mac. So if you want to do any signings on either machine or a Linux machine, it's just utilizing that KSP and making sure that you can access the server from that client machine. And then finally, we have so many different types of files we can sign. I can't go through them all, but we can do PowerShell, we can do Windows, we can do Mac applications or Android applications, whatever you need. It's most likely that CodeSign Secure can sign it. So we've taken a look at code signing and how it works. We've taken a look at weaknesses in code signing or weak code signing. We've looked at some real world examples and some different, code signing strategies. And we've also taken a look at our platform, CodeSign Secure. So now let's take a look at the future of code signing. Now, one of the things that interests me the most is post-quantum cryptography or quantum computers. I have done a lot of different webinars on it, and it continues to interest me, and it continues to just grow more interesting by the day with how they're advancing. And one of the biggest things I think that will, go on in the future of code signing, and already kind of is the use of PQC or post-quantum cryptography algorithms. Now, here's a reason that it is becoming very real. The quantum computers may have seemed like a far-flung 30, 40, 100 years away type of system, but the NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology, is already putting out their different standards for what algorithms are considered secure enough PQC algorithms. So clearly quantum computers are coming a lot faster than a lot of people think, and that's a very big deal. Right now we use classical computers and classical cryptography, but a quantum computer could crack any type of classical encryption within minutes, as opposed to the years it would take a classical computer to do it. So our whole way of security life is changing with these quantum computers becoming so real. Now, not only did NIST publish these PQC standards, but we also see a lot of different code signing platforms or organizations talking about stateless signature schemes. And that's another thing that I think will take a forefront in the coming future for code signing. So many, like I said, code signing platforms are adopting this new model, and it really helps simplify key management and reduce a lot of the complexity involved with key management. Now, not only that, but it gives you a lot better security with your, signature schemes and things like that. So having the awareness that, this stateless signature schemes and these PQC algorithms are coming is just a good way to keep yourself ahead. And specifically with PQC, these algorithms are going to need to be replaced everywhere. So if you're in any type of security or any type of, security team, it's going to be a big issue if it's not already, if we're not slowly introducing those into everything we do. Now, if you are interested yourself in looking at these NIST standards, they released these standards FIPS 203 to 205. And in those standards, they talk about crystals Kyber, crystals dilithium, and Sphinx Plus. So if you have any interest in learning about these PQC algorithms, feel free to take a look. It's a complicated read, but it's very interesting for sure. Now, one point I like to make is that Gartner actually is predicting that by 2029, the quantum computing will be in a position to actually cause a lot of issue with our classical cryptography. Now, that's just a theory on their part, a prediction on their part, but it's also highly likely that that could happen sooner too. No one's perfect. It could be sooner. It could be in 4 years, like they're saying, but either way, that's too close for comfort. So just making sure you're up to date on, quantum computing and these advancements in code signing is very important. Now, some recent CA browser forum updates with code signing, I won't go super in depth. I'll just touch on each of them. Fairly recently, they did mandate that there's a reduction to the maximum validity period for code signing certificates. So it went from 39 months to 460 days. So, a fairly significant change. They also required mandatory timestamping with these RFC 3161 compliant timestamping authorities. So basically making sure you're using a timestamping server that is compliant with this is extremely important. Additionally, there's that idea of those EV code signing certificates, and they actually introduced a framework for post-quantum EV code signing certificates. So this is a great way, for them to get prepared for the future with EV code signing certificates and how that'll look in a post-quantum world. And then finally, the private key protection mandate. So we talked about this, but a little more specifically with this mandate, they are mandating that the private keys are kept in these FIPS 140-2 level 2 or common criteria EAL4 plus compliant hardware. So basically the idea is you're storing these in these compliant pieces of hardware and your keys are being kept safe. Now, that's everything I have for you all today. Thank you so much for joining, and I look forward to hearing from you in our question section.
Riley, thank you for sharing your insights. Now we'd love to hear from our audience. I do see a few questions coming in, so let's dive in. So the first question that I see is, can I utilize existing systems for code signing such as HSMs or CI/CD pipelines with CodeSign Secure?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yes. So can I utilize existing systems for code signing such as HSMs or CI/CD pipelines with CodeSign Secure?
Yes, usually most code signing platforms, including CodeSign Secure, allow you to keep your systems as they are. You don't need to change to a different CI/CD pipeline or use a different type of HSM. Most of these code signing platforms will allow you to utilize what you already have in place, which makes it a lot easier to get set up.
Okay, perfect. Moving to the next question, how can I learn more about CodeSign Secure?
I would say the best way is to go to our website. We have a data sheet available for you. We also, on our YouTube channel, have a number of different videos that show you how CodeSign Secure works and what it looks like and things like that. So I would say those are two of your best ways to learn more.
Perfect. So that brings us to the end of today's session. If you have more questions or want to explore anything that we discussed in more detail, we'd love to hear from you. You can connect with us through our website at www.encryptionconsulting.com or send us an email at info@encryptionconsulting.com. Thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in the next webinar.
Thank you all.